The initial movement is the worst for travellers to the moon. They will be catapulted up as if blasted by the force of gunpowder, flying over mountains and oceans.
The galaxy is nothing but a collection of countless stars. Wherever you turn the telescope, the eye will immediately see a vast quantity of stars.
Kepler and Galileo, two confidants, scholars, rivals, who lived more than 400 years ago at a time when modern science was just in its infancy. The Piazza dei Miracoli, the Square of Miracles, in Pisa, looked in 1583 just as it does today. Pisa, famous all over Europe for one of the oldest and most renowned universities, was a student city at a time when no distinction was made between science, philosophy and religion. "19-year-old Galileo Galilei was a mathematics student from a good family, curious and full of enthusiasm for life around him, and a very devout Catholic. However, one day his inborn curiosity distracted him from his prayers. He realized the chandelier suspended from the cathedral ceiling was moving, but why? He wondered whether the swing could be calculated. Galileo worked on these questions. His insights led to the laws of the pendulum, which form part of the foundation on which modern mechanics is built. His family believed there was no money in making discoveries such as this. When his father's finances became tight, he ordered his son to leave Pisa and come home to Florence. At the same time, 700 kilometers to the north, Johannes Kepler, 9 years Galileo's junior, was still attending school. He did not get on with his fellow students at the Protestant boarding school in Tübingen. Mistrust and tale-telling were the order of the day. Kepler's diary entries are clear.
I suffered terribly and almost died of my woes. The reason was my disgrace and the hatred of my classmates, whom I, driven by fear, had reported. During an argument that arose over drinks, I was beaten.
Kepler just didn't fit in. The reasons for this are to be found in his childhood. His father had abandoned the family and travelled around as a common foot soldier. For those he had left behind, that didn't just mean disgrace, it also meant terrible privation. The fear of poverty was to follow Kepler throughout his life. But despite all of his problems, he finished school and in 1588 began studying theology at the university in Tübingen. There his teacher, Michael Mestlin, confronted him with Copernicus's teachings for the first time. He started to suspect that the sun didn't necessarily have to revolve around the earth. Galileo put his foot down and stood up to his father. Without having completed his degree, he returned to Pisa as an associate professor. To this day, the Leaning Tower of Pisa provokes people to perform the strangest experiments. For Galileo, too, observations and experiments were more important than the mere quoting and interpreting of old knowledge. This naturally brought him into constant conflict with accepted opinion. The aim of his research were the laws regulating the free fall of bodies. The idea that he threw objects from the Leaning Tower for this purpose is a myth. He in fact used a less spectacular variant in his own study, an inclined plane with a ball. He timed the duration of the movement with a water clock. Galileo had problems with professorial dignity. In a satirical poem, he complained about the mandatory uniform, the toga, because it didn't even allow the staff to go to brothels unnoticed, making them dependent on masturbation. Although equally sinful, it was much less satisfying, he claimed. He was also drowning in debt. After his father's death, he became responsible for the entire family, financially too. When a post became free at the University of Padua, he immediately took it up because his salary there would be significantly higher. Johannes Kepler ended his theology studies early. In the Styrian region of Austria, Protestant teachers were needed. Graduates from the University of Tübingen were much sought after all over the German-speaking world. In 1594, straight out of university, Kepler got a job as a maths teacher at the Protestant school in Graz.
An astronomical post came up, but to tell the truth, I had to be talked into taking it by my teachers. Not because I was worried the city was too far away, but because of the unexpected and despised nature of the job and the poverty of my training in this area of philosophy. I accepted, more equipped with talent than with knowledge, but I stated repeatedly that I reserved the right to take a better position if one came up.
What Kepler didn't know was that Graz was the centre of a religious war, which, while local, was no less fierce. It split the city into two enemy camps. The one camp was made up of the Catholic Habsburgs in Graz Castle, with a Catholic educational institution immediately opposite, the old university. Graz Cathedral was their parish church. The other camp consisted of the Protestant knights, to whom craftsmen, merchants and the mayor were allied. Their educational institution was the collegiate school, whose foundation walls still form one side of the old square known as the Paradise-Hof. As a mathematician at the Protestant school, Kepler earned less than a simple craftsman, nor was he a talented teacher. After a year, not a single mathematics student still showed up to his classes, which is why he had to turn to teaching other subjects as well. But the job gave him enough time for his theoretical research to explain the universe, calculations that hadn't let him go since his first contact with the teachings of Copernicus. The Church's own worldview had been put forth by Ptolemy. In the 2nd century AD, the Greek astronomer placed the Earth at the centre of the world, orbited by the solar system's planets and even the Sun itself. But after 1543, a new model made the Ptolemaic world seem more and more doubtful. The astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus had found the solution, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. On the Revolutions of Celestial Spheres was the title of the book that placed the Sun at the centre. Few scientists recognized this answer as correct. Kepler was one of them. In Graz, he was working on his first book, Mysterium Cosmographicum. As a mathematician, he believed in an aesthetic logic of the world. A pretty model, but unfortunately incorrect, since it assumed the planetary orbits were circular. He sent his work to the most famous astronomer of the time, Tycho Brahe, for evaluation. His reply shows him to have been greatly impressed.
Your book, which you call a forerunner of cosmographical treatises, was extraordinarily to my liking. Your fine reasoning and your shrewd studies shine out brightly.
Und euer scharfsinniges Studium leuchtet daraus hell hervor.
As far as I can support you in these difficult investigations, you will not find me in the least unapproachable, particularly when you come to visit me. And I shall be very pleased to talk at length and face to face about these sublime issues.
Kepler sent a further 2 copies of the book to the famous University of Padua, which was controlled by Venice and profited from its wealth. There, a certain Galileju heard about this book. Galileju, who was moving back and forth between his teaching duties and the erotic distractions of Venice, immediately seized the opportunity to get in touch with his German colleague.
Your book, most learned sir, that you sent me through Paulus Umberger, I received not days, but merely hours ago. I want to thank you for honouring me with such proof of your friendship.
Even though Mysterium Cosmographicum wasn't addressed to him, his letter of thanks to Kepler was positively effusive, outing him as a follower of the Copernican theory. Nor did he forget to mention his own scientific significance.
I am really very lucky to have such a man as a companion in the quest for truth, and as a friend of the truth, because it is dreadful that they are so few and far between who strive for truth and do not pursue an incorrect way of philosophizing.
At this point in time, Galileju hadn't yet published anything apart from a highly profitable instruction manual for a military compass. He was still very unwilling to cause trouble for himself by surprising and possibly even shocking the world of science with new ideas. Shyly and somewhat meekly, he made the following admission to his German colleague.
I am put off by the personal fate of Copernicus, who is our teacher. He acquired immortal fame amongst a few, but he is mocked and ridiculed by so many, because there are so many fools in the world. I would dare make my thoughts public if more people had the same attitude as you. Since this isn't the case, I won't be doing so.
Maybe the distractions were just too plentiful for him. Venice didn't only have beautiful women, it also had Europe's loosest morals. Neither were easily reconcilable with the lofty study of the world's secrets. Galileju was able to resist a lot, but not temptation. In his case, temptation went by the name of Marina Gamba. She didn't ask questions. Marriage was out of the question for the ambitious professor. Marina Gamba came from a poor background and so was unable to supply a dowry. And she would have been in the way of Galileo's plans to make it into the highest circles of society. Nevertheless, 3 children were born from this union. Puritanical Graz was a completely different proposition. A liaison like the one Galileju was having in Italy would have been unthinkable here. Kepler was making it particularly tough for himself. The object of his affection was called Barbara Müller, a young widow from a bourgeois family. Barbara brought a teenage daughter into the marriage and a lot of money. Kepler hoped for a secure existence filled with scientific work. The indecision of his colleague in Catholic Italy was incomprehensible to the Protestant Kepler.
Be of good cheer, Galileju, and step forward. If my suspicions are correct, there are few amongst Europe's significant mathematicians who would disagree with us. That's how great the power of the truth is. If Italy seems less well suited to your publications, and you're confronted with obstacles there,
Und wenn ihr dort Hindernisse zu
maybe
erwarten
Germany
habt,
will grant you this freedom.
wird uns vielleicht Deutschland diese Freiheit gewähren.
Kepler's invitation triggered even more hesitation in Galileo, which lasted for 13 years. The naive German obviously didn't have the faintest idea what mattered to Galileo. The power of truth was neither here nor there. His career was on the line.
Galileo was a completely different character from Kepler as far as we can discern, and we have quite good evidence. He was a little arrogant, sometimes even haughty, fired up by his great insights. He was characterized by a certain snobbishness and national pride. In comparison with Kepler, he was quite reserved and didn't fully engage in the correspondence. It was as if he didn't recognize this Tedesco as an equal partner. Kepler was also a bit younger and not a university professor. So we must assume Galileo was quite goal-oriented in his social climbing, and he also made great distinctions in his communications, depending on his correspondent's background and professional standing.
The light of truth is always politically tainted. The Counter-Reformation didn't make an exception for science. Johannes Kepler was given an ultimatum. Either he had to convert to Catholicism or leave Graz. But what would then become of his wife's fortune? For financial reasons, he spent months contemplating whether it wouldn't be easier to just convert. But then, Kepler and his family chose to start afresh by emigrating to Prague. The fraternal strife and the resulting division of the House of Habsburg had, however, created political conditions in Prague that were better for Protestants than other places in the Habsburg Empire, at least at the time. In addition, Prague's court mathematician, Tycho Brahe, promised to welcome Kepler with open arms and find him a post, but the reality was a little different. Kepler was extremely disappointed because the much older Brahe didn't see him as an equal in scientific terms, but rather as a human computer. Conflict seemed unavoidable. Kepler was mainly interested in Brahe's extensive data collection. Brahe had spent decades meticulously documenting his celestial observations.
Every one of his instruments costs more than my entire family fortune. He is so incredibly rich, but, like most rich people, he does not know how to put his wealth to use. That's why it was important to separate him from his riches, and, with all modesty, I have played my part in that. I got him to publish his observations without conditions, all of them.
Common envy may well have played a role in Kepler's verdict on his famous colleague. Tycho Brahe immediately gave his new computer the most difficult task, the orbit of Mars. Mars describes the strangest loops in our night sky. Today we know they're created by the different times it takes Earth and Mars to orbit the Sun. Tycho Brahe was no follower of the new Copernican worldview. He had his own solution, the Tychonic worldview. The Sun and Moon orbit the Earth, while the other planets orbit the Sun. By this point, a conflict between Kepler and Brahe was almost inevitable, and not just because of their different understanding of the universe.
Es hat also dann immer wieder
There were constant arguments. At first, Kepler tried to avoid them, but then it became impossible for him to carry on playing the little assistant. That's how Tycho Brahe saw him, just like the rest of his family. Tycho Brahe constantly used them, assistants, his daughters, his sons-in-law, even his wife, to perform observations. It was foreseeable that it couldn't go on this way, but Brahe died before things fell apart.
In 1601, a year after Kepler's arrival in Prague, Tycho Brahe unexpectedly died. Emperor Rudolf II proclaimed Kepler as Brahe's successor. The main task of the new imperial court mathematician was to work through Brahe's papers. Properly interpreted, the data revealed sensational information.
You
think that I first think of any old hypothesis and then embellish it as I please, and only after that you think I prove it with my observations? You are very much mistaken. The truth is that when a hypothesis has been established and justified with the help of observations, I get a strange longing to investigate whether I can find a natural, pleasing connection in it.
Brahe's observational data, coupled with Kepler's interpretations, became the foundation of modern astronomy. He saw a meaning in the endless rows of numbers in the tables. The irregularity of just 8 minutes of arc in the coordinates of Mars's orbit just wouldn't leave the master mathematician alone. Mars's orbit couldn't be a perfect circle. The eccentric circle was the solution to the problem, an elliptical orbit. Kepler's first law of planetary motion was found. Planets move in ellipses, with the Sun at one focus. A short while later, the location and time data of Tycho Brahe's observations led Kepler to his second law of planetary motion. It states that the line joining a planet and the Sun sweeps out equal areas during equal intervals of time. If the same segment of time is marked out along the orbit, the triangular areas thus created are always the same size. Kepler published these two laws in his Astronomia Nova, New Astronomy, in 1609. This work was of a revolutionary character.
That could already be gleaned from the subtitle of Astronomia Nova, which was Physica Coelestis, meaning celestial physics. This was fundamental celestial physics, and that's what was revolutionary about it. Kepler tried to investigate what he could see. He transformed astronomy from what was initially a purely mathematical, computing, descriptive science into one that delivered fundamental answers. That's exactly the claim which has been continued over the past 400 years and which has been applied to all areas of the universe.
In Padua, Galileo was spending his time with simpler but also significantly more profitable subjects. With research commissions for Venice's armament industry, which was going ahead at full steam. These also included the calculation of curves to optimize the range of cannon. Europe was getting ready for the 30 Years' War. The celestial signs also seemed to herald a storm. When a supernova appeared in the sky above Prague, Kepler didn't yet suspect what sensational insights observation of the star would bring.
In 1604, there was suddenly a new star, as Kepler called it, in the sky in the constellation of Ophiuchus, or Serpent Holder. It could be seen for several months, but then it became less and less bright, and then suddenly it wasn't there anymore. What was worse was that Kepler, by using nothing but trigonometric observations, was able to prove it had to be further away than the Moon. Had it been as close as the Moon or closer, an angular displacement would have been witnessed during the observations at different times. It had been demonstrated that changes took place in the world of fixed stars. We now interpret that as stars exploding, of which there are still surviving remnants. The fact that such changes occurred made people realize that the entire cosmos was alive, as it were.
Man hat plötzlich gesehen, der ganze Kosmos lebt sozusagen.
One day, a travelling merchant came to Padua with the latest invention from Holland in his luggage, a telescope. It is unclear who really invented it. The Dutchman Hans Lippershey had registered the patent 10 months earlier. He was the first to produce a practical telescope. The merchant wanted to offer it to Venice for military purposes. He wanted 1,000 sequins for it, but Paolo Sarpi, an important advisor to the Venetian government and a close friend of Galileo, suggested not buying it and waiting to see whether Galileo could produce something better.
First, I prepared a lead pipe. At each end, I affixed a lens. Both lenses were flat on one side. One of them was convex on its other side. The other lens was concave. I looked through the concave side and saw objects quite large and close up. They looked 3 times closer and 9 times larger than when seen with the naked eye. Later, I built a more precise instrument that magnified objects by a factor of 60.
Das die Gegenstände mehr als 60 Mal größer zeigte.
The plan was successful, but Galileo didn't sell his telescope, at least not immediately. That would have been below his dignity. He wasn't a mere craftsman after all. He gave it to the government of Venice after an impressive demonstration on the Campanile. The city returned the favour. Galileo was given a lifetime professorship at the University of Padua. His salary was doubled. At the same time, in Prague, Kepler could only dream of a fixed income. Although he was the imperial court mathematician, it turned out to be a title without pay. In order to get the emperor's attention, Kepler dedicated Astronomia Nova to him in the hope of finally getting his promised salary in return. But Emperor Rudolf II had other worries. The argument between him and his brother Matthias in Vienna escalated. The entire budget was invested in armaments. Particularly expensive was the army of Passau, a group of mercenaries notorious for their brutality. In 1610, a peace treaty came into effect. Both sides demobilized their soldiers, including the army of Passau. In Italy, little was known about the war that was looming. Galileo used his new invention in Padua not just to make money. One night he took the telescope out onto the terrace of his house and aimed it at the stars. What he saw would determine the rest of his life. He first looked at the moon. The Earth satellite had stimulated human imagination for millennia. Since the moon is the closest object to the Earth, a lot could be determined from the technology now available to Galileo. Galileo found a phenomenon comparable to sunrise on Earth.
When we see the valleys not yet filled with light, there are also the mountains that surround them on the sides that face away from the sun, which are crowned by bright boundaries, lit-up ridges.
Galileo captured the new face of the moon in drawings and sketches. He was the first to correctly interpret the surface of the moon. From the jagged terminator, the line between light and shadow, he clearly saw that it wasn't smooth like a ball. In Prague, Kepler was thrilled by his colleagues' descriptions of the moon. Today, we know that the round craters were created by meteorite impacts. Kepler's view was much more poetic.
You compare them to the valleys on Earth, and I have to admit that valleys of similarly round nature exist, particularly in Styria.
Galileo was not the first to look at the sky with a telescope, but he seems to have been the first to have correctly interpreted what he saw, and he continuously refined the telescope through constant trial and error. The IMSS, the University Institute and Museum in Florence, now houses Galileo's only two surviving original telescopes. The people here know all about the secret and the scientific success of Galileo's telescope.
There were two reasons why the quality of the image was very much better. The first was the quality of the finish. Galileo had an empirical method of working on lenses that was very much more precise than the methods used by other telescope makers at the time. The second reason was the quality of the glass. Galileo was able to use particularly transparent and pure glass that came from the kilns of Murano. Galileo taught in Padua and was frequently in Venice. He was friendly with the glassmakers of Murano and was able to get his hands on material whose purity guaranteed a much greater sharpness. I have had the opportunity to look through one of Galileo's original telescopes. When we find an instrument of this type, we think we won't see anything, but you can in fact see. To correct these problems, Galileo invented an aperture to make the surface of the lens less spherical, and as a result reduced the chromatic aberration. Nevertheless, this device also had negative consequences. It limited the field of vision enormously. He was only able to see a third or a quarter of the moon at any one time. He had to memorize the section and then look at the next, so he could put it all together on paper.
During the countless nights behind the telescope, Galileo discovered 4 new celestial bodies, the moons of Jupiter. His decision to name them Medicean stars after the Medici, Italy's most powerful aristocratic family, was as modest as it was calculating. Galileo thereby flattered the young Prince Cosimo II, a former student, and hoped he would get a new, more lucrative position in Florence, the home city of the Medici family. In addition, his social standing at the court of Florence would be very much higher than that of a minor professor in Padua. His mistress, Marina Gamba, got in the way of these plans, so he simply abandoned her with their children when the Medici gave him a position at their Florentine court in 1610. Their son stayed with his mother at first. Galileo housed his 2 daughters in the San Matteo convent near Florence, where they were to spend the rest of their lives. The elder daughter was now called Sister Maria Celeste. Of all his children, she was his favorite. Galileo was in close contact with her until her death. Galileo became more and more committed to science. He published the sidereal messenger, the Sidereus Nuncius. In this work, Galileo gave a detailed description of the new celestial bodies. Science had been turned upside down. The Medici, to whom Galileo had dedicated the work, were still skeptical, for fear the discovery named in their honor would bring ridicule upon them. Then the Italian was helped out by a letter from his German colleague.
Now, inventive Galileo, I'm going to give your tireless effort the praise it deserves. You have put all reservations aside and allowed your eyes to investigate without hesitation, chasing all the spectres of ignorance away.
Jene Gespenster der Unwissenheit vertrieben, unter der Kraft eures Beweises.
Under the power of your proof, I acknowledge the incredible finesse of the celestial substance.
Himmlischen Substanz.
As a child, Kepler had fallen ill with smallpox and had ever since suffered from severe short-sightedness. He didn't possess his own telescope, and so he asked Galileo for one. Kepler wanted to calculate the mathematical principle of the telescope, and maybe even improve it.
You
have awoken a great longing in me to see your instrument, so that I, like you, can also enjoy the spectacle of the sky.
Even the instrument I am using is no longer mine. The Grand Duke of Tuscany requested it from me to exhibit in his gallery. In Florence, I am going to make instruments as soon as possible to send to my friends.
That may have been more lip service. He wanted to have the exclusive rights and wanted to be ahead of the field. That's the first point. The second is that he said he couldn't give his away because it belonged to the Grand Duke. Whether this is historically true is a different matter. He just wanted his telescope for himself and didn't just want to give it to others.
He was definitely thinking about his rivals. Galileo was always careful to guard his insights very closely. It was his telescope. He developed it for himself and for the council in Venice. But it was his creation, and as such he claimed it for himself.
Johannes Kepler never received a telescope from Galileo, and as a result he was forced to build his own. Although he didn't achieve the optical quality of Galileo's instrument, Kepler calculated the optical principle of the astronomical telescope, thereby laying the foundation of modern space observation. Instead of a telescope, Galileo sent his colleague mysterious phrases and word games.
Here is an anagram about an important observation that contains a nice proof of the construction of the world in line with Pythagoras and Copernicus. Haec immatura me jam frustra leguntur. Oh, why?
The puzzle in which Galileo hid his message drove Kepler to despair. After 8 attempts to solve it, he gave up.
Venus mimics the phases of the moon. I first saw Venus as a perfect circle, then later as a semicircle, and then as sickle-shaped, facing away from the sun. This wonderful observation is certain proof of the fact that Venus moves around the sun. You and the other Copernicans should be proud to have philosophized correctly.
To the north of the Alps, Europe had different worries. While Galileo gave him playful mysteries to solve, Kepler's world in Prague came crashing down around him. Having been officially dismissed, the notorious army of Passau marched on Prague and attacked the civilian population with unimaginable acts of cruelty. War and plague transformed the city into a morgue. Kepler's son died of smallpox. Kepler wanted to bring his wife and family to safety and applied for a position as a mathematician in the Austrian city of Linz, but it was too late for his wife. Barbara Kepler died before the move.
I lost my wife, and the effort I had made, mainly for her recovery, was for nothing. Numbed by the heinous acts of the soldiers and the sight of the bloody battle in the city, tormented by the hopelessness of a better future, she became infected at the end of her suffering with the Hungarian spotted fever.
All Kepler could do was find refuge in his work. His correspondence with his colleague in Italy ceased to captivate him. Kepler had had enough and wrote Galileo a letter requesting a break. This was not inconvenient for Galileo because his new post with the Medici family tied him down more than expected. Florentine court life proved to be a full-time job. Scientific discussion and battles of words were very fashionable, and so Galileo considered it necessary not just to have an opinion on every imaginable aspect of human life, but also to defend it scientifically. Why else did the Medici family have a famous scientist in the house?
Why does ice float at the surface?
The dispute with Florentine intellectuals about this question lasted for almost a year. It was a bothersome and time-consuming issue that hindered Galileo from performing his astronomical observations. He nevertheless made a sensational discovery, which he told Kepler about in 1612.
I think it would please you to hear that I have finally calculated the orbital times of the moons of Jupiter and have set up tables to show them. The sun, around 15 months or more have gone by since I first observed dark spots on the sun. In summer, when I was in Rome, I showed them to some prelates and others. Various opinions about them were voiced and published, but they are all far removed from the truth.
His observation of the sunspots had two main consequences. One affected people's worldview, the other was practical. The change in people's worldview was that the sun was not in fact immaculate, as had been thought for centuries. It wasn't a divine body, a divine being. It was merely a body where spots appeared and disappeared again. The practical consequence was a very pleasant one. The spots gave the sun a structure that rotated with the sun, allowing scientists to calculate how long it took the sun to spin around its own axis. That was, of course, a revolutionary insight.
Galileo's revolutionary insight only reached Kepler after quite some time, since he had already left Prague for Linz.
Here in Linz, we do not enjoy the benefits of a postal service. The messengers have hostile attitudes towards intellectuals.
For Kepler, his Italian colleagues' research results seemed to diminish in importance more and more. Kepler was working again as a teacher at a religious foundation school. This was the same position he had already held in Graz. It was a step back for his career, but his private life came first. Kepler married a second time, but only after being undecided for a long time between 11 candidates.
Was it divine destiny or my moral failing that over the past 2 years or more my mind has been pulled in so many directions and I have watched out for so many different potential matches, each of whom so different from the other? If it was divine destiny, what purposes were hidden behind all of the people and actions?
He led the contemplative life of a provincial scholar with a secure job, for whom no problem, never mind how trivial, was too small. He, the man who had measured the cosmos, was inspired by the wine merchants on the Danube to mathematically investigate the volumes of wine barrels. Somehow he was mistrustful of the measuring method in Linz.
The seller came with a measuring rod. It was his only instrument. He didn't take the differences between the barrels into account. He ignored their shapes and made no calculations. He inserted the tip of the iron rod into the filling hole of the full barrel at an angle, all the way to the lower edge of the two circular wooden lids.
The scientific result of this mistrust was immediately published. The Nova Stereometria was one of a total of 23 publications Kepler produced during his 14-year stay in Linz. In Linz, Kepler finally had enough time and peace to let his curiosity do some exploring. On the 15th of May 1618, he discovered, quite suddenly according to his own statement, the third law of planetary motion, which has remained a cornerstone of modern astronomy to this day. The squares of the planetary orbital times are exactly proportional to the cubes of the semi-major axes of their orbits. That sounds a lot more complicated than it is. Very simply put, it means the further a planet is from the Sun, the slower it moves. Only a few days after this discovery, on the 23rd of May 1618, Europe fell into chaos. The defenestration of Prague triggered the 30 Years' War. Ferdinand of Austria fought back. The persecution of Protestants began. Linz was occupied by Catholic Bavarian troops. Kepler received news that his mother had been arrested and was to be put on trial for witchcraft. Kepler moved his family to Regensburg. He himself moved on to Württemberg to defend his mother in court, but the trial lasted longer than anticipated.
My family are not at risk of life and limb, and the cloud over our good reputation will be split open by the bright light of truth. But it takes up the little wealth we have, and the trial has still not ended.
Although Kepler's mother wasn't tortured, she was threatened with torture, which was vividly described to her. But she confessed to nothing. Since no offence could be proved, she was released from prison in October 1621.
She wasn't acquitted. That would have been too expensive for the local ruler. She was just let go secretly. Kepler fought that because he wanted his costs back. He had invested a lot in this trial and wanted his mother to be formally acquitted. In that case, he could have requested his money back, but it wasn't to be. Kepler's mother died 6 months later.
Even during the long trial, and always on the road, Kepler started on further works, Harmonices Mundi and Epitome of Copernican Astronomy.
Kepler was a real workaholic who even worked under the worst conditions, during carriage rides and in the middle of the night when a window of opportunity presented itself. That's the only way we can explain how he created such an incredible life's work. The average scientist today wouldn't be able to produce a tenth of the work under the same conditions.
Kepler's Epitome was put on the index of forbidden books in Italy, since it defended the Copernican worldview. Shortly before its publication, Copernicus's teachings had been prohibited by decree, 80 years after their author's death.
Now the rash behavior of certain individuals who couldn't cope with the astronomical teachings at the right place and following the right method has led to the reading of Copernicus, which was allowed for 80 years to be forbidden until the book has been improved.
verbessert würde.
Kepler's accusation was aimed at Galileo in Florence, who, as Kepler found out, was presenting his own scientific insights all too vehemently. But nobody wanted to attack the famous scholar directly, and so instead the Copernican teachings, which also underlay Galilean thought, were banned. An elegant solution. From now on, anyone who claimed the Earth revolved around the Sun was a heretic. Problem solved. Galileo's fame was declining. He had not delivered any new insights in Florence for quite some time. His opponents were getting stronger and more powerful. Then Galileo burst back onto the scientific stage in 1623 with his work Il Saggiatore. 5 years previously, in 1618, 3 comets had shown up in the sky within a year, but Galileo had failed to observe them. Now he spoke out polemically about the alleged stupidity of his colleagues. He claimed comets were mere light reflections in the Earth's atmosphere. They were optical appearances, definitely not celestial bodies. Johannes Kepler finally completed his life's work in 1624 with the Rudolphine Tables. Now his work of decades just had to go to print. Kepler wanted to publish in Linz, but a peasants' revolt put an end to that plan. In order to protect himself, his family and his work, Kepler fled again. He once again took his family to Regensburg. He himself travelled on in search of money and a printing press.
The
Rudolphine tables were his life's work, because this was the first time he was able to apply the ellipse hypothesis to his planetary laws in the ephemerides. In other words, the prediction of the planetary positions, which is what the general public was so interested in. Everyone was saying, give us better planetary positions. And that was possible for the first time with the Rudolphine tables, based on the laws of planetary motion.
The public interest had practical reasons. Planetary positions were necessary for the creation of horoscopes. The more precisely the positions could be calculated, the more exact the foretelling of the future. At the same time, Galileo believed he had finally arrived at the top. With an incredible overestimation of his own capabilities, he stepped onto very thin ice with his arguments, stating the Ptolemaic worldview to be unscientific. With this heresy, he publicly challenged the Church. Galileo tried to dress up his revolutionary ideas as a fictitious dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. He hoped to ensure that this would give the Inquisition nothing to attack, but he was very wrong. The dialogue was to become his main work, contributing to his fame as well as to his downfall. Kepler saw no way of having the Rudolphine tables printed. Then Wallenstein intervened. The Emperor's commander-in-chief was as superstitious as he was successful. Horoscopes were very important to him. Wallenstein valued Kepler in consequence, and so promised him a high annual salary, plus the printing press in his castle in Sagan. Kepler accepted the offer, even though he considered Wallenstein an uncertain sponsor.
I have to hurry up to finish what I've started. If I should have to leave Sagan, I'd prefer to leave something completed behind rather than truncated fragments.
Verstümmelte Bruchstücke.
Finally, the book was printed and available for the public to buy. But on the 13th of September 1630, Wallenstein was dismissed by the Emperor. Kepler panicked because he believed this would also destroy his livelihood. He travelled back to his family in Regensburg to contemplate his future and to ask for money from the Emperor. But the exertions were too much. On the 15th of November 1630, Johannes Kepler died. He was buried in Regensburg in the Protestant cemetery outside the city.
Himmel durchmaß mein Geist.
I measured the heavens, now the depth of the earth I measure. My mind looked to the sky, now my earthly body rests here.
Der irdische Leib.
Galileo was overjoyed. In 1631 he rented a villa in Arcetri, in the hills near Florence. That allowed him to live in the immediate vicinity of the monastery that was home to his daughters. But his good fortune was short-lived. The Inquisition found enough reasons to act against Galileo for his dialogue. The aged scholar was ordered to come to Rome. The world-famous trial proceeded inexorably. In the end, Galileo was to fail because of his miscalculation of his own importance.
I think Galileo constantly overestimated himself, not just in one instance, not just regarding his acknowledgement of the Copernican teachings. His main work, the Dialogo, was written in both Latin and Italian. That made the curious sit up, of course. They said, if this man suddenly starts writing in Italian, and the people start reading that, even though many people were still illiterate, it could become problematic for the Church. The heliocentric worldview went against Church doctrine, and so the Curia had to respond.
The Curia reacted. Galileo was forced to recant his theories. As a broken man, he returned to Arcetri from Rome in 1633. The house he had rented now meant banishment, house arrest, and a ban on working. But fate was harsher still, delivering the final blow. Three months later, his favourite daughter, Sister Maria Celeste, died. And if that weren't enough, Galileo was losing his eyesight. He spent the last 9 years of his life in increasing darkness. Galileo died on the 8th of January, 1642. It was only 90 years later, in 1736, that Galileo's mortal remains were moved to Santa Croce in Florence, to a tomb especially built for him. Another 100 years later, in 1835, the Dialogue was removed from the Index of Forbidden Books. In 1992, Galileo was officially rehabilitated by Pope John Paul II.
You must measure what is measurable and what is not measurable. You have to make measurable.
Kepler's exact burial place has not been found. The cemetery outside Regensburg, where he was buried, no longer exists. A student hostel now stands on the site. All that is left is a name.
Give me ships with the proper sails for celestial flight. But who should live in those worlds if indeed they are inhabited? Are we, or are they, the masters of the universe? And is all this made for man?
Ist dies alles dem Menschen gemacht?
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise,
by a pair of roguish eyes, in a moment my poor heart was stole away. A smile was all she gave to me, but soon we were happy as could be. I immediately raised my hat and finally did remark, I never shall forget the charmer that I met. That happy day was strolling in the park. That happy day was strolling in the park.